It is early morning, the 14th of October, in the year 1066. Somewhere in the soft, wooded hills of southern England, two armies are gathering on opposite sides of a long, sloping ridge. Mist still clings to the low ground. Men breathe into their hands. Behind the English line, a horse shifts its weight, and a harness creaks. Among the Norman ranks, a priest moves quietly between the soldiers. Neither side yet knows how this day will end. We will return to this hillside. But to understand why these two armies came to be standing here, facing one another across a few hundred yards of English countryside, we have to go back further, past the ships and the marching columns, past the broken promises and the disputed oaths, to a quieter England, ruled by a king who left no son. Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we're going to follow the story of 1066, not simply as a single battle, but as the final chapter of a much longer struggle. A struggle over who had the right to rule England, and why three very different men each believed, in his own way, that the crown was his. Settle in. Let your eyes close if they want to, and let's begin at the beginning. In the middle years of the 11th century, England was not the fragmented, disorganized place the word medieval sometimes suggests. It was, in fact, one of the wealthier and more administratively sophisticated kingdoms in Western Europe. It had a functioning system of shires and hundreds, local units of government, each with its own court, each responsible for keeping order and collecting the king's revenue. It had a currency that was trusted and widely used, regularly reminted to a consistent standard. It had a system of written law, going back through generations of Anglo-Saxon kings, and a class of officials, reeves, sheriffs, bishops, who kept that system running whether or not the king himself was paying close attention. At the head of this kingdom, since 1042, sat Edward, later remembered as Edward the Confessor. He had come to the throne after a difficult childhood. Decades earlier, when he was still a boy, a series of Viking conquests had driven his family from power, and Edward spent much of his youth in exile across the Channel, in Normandy, among relatives of his mother. He did not return to rule England until he was well into his 30s, a king who had spent more of his life abroad than at home, arriving to take a throne that many in England barely recognized him as having a natural claim to. Edward's reign is often described, by later and more sympathetic writers, as peaceful and pious. There is truth in this. He was, by most accounts, a sincerely religious man, drawn to the church and to quiet ritual, more than to war or court intrigue. But it would be a mistake to imagine his England as calm, simply because Edward preferred calm. Beneath the surface of his reign, real power was contested, and increasingly, it belonged not to the king at all, but to a single, extraordinarily ambitious family, the Godwins. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was already one of the most powerful men in England by the time Edward returned from exile. He controlled the richest and most populous earldom in the kingdom, commanded the loyalty of a wide network of lesser nobles, and had, over the years, married his children into positions of real influence. His daughter, Edith, became Edward's queen, a union that was as much political alliance as romance, binding the new king to the most formidable family in the realm. Godwin's sons, in turn, stood positioned to inherit earldoms of their own. This arrangement was, from the beginning, an uneasy one. Edward owed his throne in part to Godwin's support, but he did not necessarily trust the man who had given it. Tensions simmered, quiet mostly, but real, over how much power one family should hold, and over the king's own instinct to favor Norman advisors and clergy, men he had grown close to during his years abroad. English nobles, watching foreigners rise in influence at court, did not always welcome it. To understand what was at stake in these years, it helps to step back from kings and earls for a moment and consider how most people actually lived. England in the 1040s and 1050s was still overwhelmingly a rural country. The vast majority of its population worked the land, ploughing, sowing, and harvesting on a rhythm dictated by the seasons rather than by anything happening at court. A typical village might consist of a cluster of timber and thatch houses, a manor hall belonging to a local lord, and a small parish church, itself often built of wood rather than stone. Fields were worked in open strips, shared and rotated according to long-established local custom. Livestock, pigs, sheep, cattle, grazed on common land. Beer, bread, and pottage, made from grains and vegetables, formed the backbone of most people's diet. Meat was a periodic addition rather than a daily expectation. Above this rural world sat a structure of obligation, connecting the humblest farmer, in a roundabout way, all the way up to the king. Local lords owed service and loyalty to earls. Earls owed service to the crown, and in times of danger, ordinary free men could be called upon to serve in the fyrd, a militia-like levy, not a standing professional army, made up of men who were farmers and craftsmen the rest of the year. The church, meanwhile, was woven into nearly every part of daily life, not just religious observance, but the keeping of records, the marking of time through feast days and fasts, and often the only source of learning or medical care available in a given area. This was the England Edward inherited, and that the Godwin family, in practice, helped to run alongside him. It was wealthy. It was orderly, by the standards of the age, and at its center sat a growing, unresolved question that nobody in the 1040s could yet answer with certainty. Who would rule after Edward, a king who, as the years went on, showed no sign of producing an heir of his own? That question would not be answered quietly, and its first threads led, unexpectedly, across the sea. To understand why a duke from northern France would one day believe he had a legitimate claim to the English throne, it helps to remember where Edward had spent the years before he became king. When Edward was still a child, his father's kingdom was overrun by Danish conquest, and the royal family scattered. Edward and his brother were sent across the Channel, into the care of relatives in Normandy, a region that was itself the product of an earlier wave of Scandinavian settlement, ruled by descendants of Viking chieftains who had, over generations, adopted French language, French customs, and a French style of government, while keeping something of their old martial character. Edward grew up there. By the time he returned to England as king in 1042, he was a man shaped as much by Norman court life as by anything English. He spoke French more comfortably than he likely spoke the English of the villages around him. He brought Norman clergy and Norman advisors with him when he crossed back to take the throne, and continued, throughout his reign, to favor Norman churchmen for important positions, a habit that quietly irritated a number of his English earls, who saw foreign appointees taking posts that might otherwise have gone to their own families or allies. Among Edward's Norman relatives was a young duke who would, in time, become the central figure standing against Harold Godwinson on that October morning at Hastings. William. William's own path to power had been anything but smooth. He had become Duke of Normandy as a boy, following his father's death, and his early years in power carried all the instability one would expect around a child ruler. Rival nobles maneuvering for influence, assassination attempts against those who guarded him, and stretches when it was genuinely unclear whether he would survive to adulthood, let alone rule effectively. By his 20s, however, William had proven himself a capable and often ruthless military leader, putting down rebellions among his own nobility and steadily consolidating control over a duchy that had, not long before, seemed likely to fracture entirely. It was during these years, while William fought to secure his own position at home, that his connection to the English court took on real significance. Edward, distant relative and fellow product of Norman upbringing, represented both a personal tie and, potentially, a political opportunity. Norman chroniclers writing later, after William had become King of England, would claim that Edward promised the English throne to William directly, during a visit William supposedly made to England in the early 1050s. From the evidence that survives, it is impossible to know exactly what was said between the two men, or whether any promise of this kind was made at all, in the form later Norman writers described it. What can be said with more confidence is that Edward's Norman sympathies were real, that contact between the English and Norman courts continued over these years, and that by the time William later pressed his claim to the throne, he did so with a story already prepared, one in which he was not a foreign invader, but a rightful heir being denied what had already been promised to him. Whatever passed between Edward and William, it did not settle the succession. Edward continued to rule, continued to favor Norman churchmen at court, and continued to leave the question of who would follow him unresolved. Meanwhile, back in England, the ordinary business of the kingdom went on. Manors changed hands. Harvests came in good years and thin ones. Ships from Normandy, Flanders, and further afield continued to cross the Channel, carrying wine, cloth, and news, along with the churchmen and travelers who moved fairly freely between the English and Norman worlds that were, in these years, far more connected than the later drama of conquest might suggest. Into this world, an England prosperous but politically uncertain, closely tied to Normandy yet increasingly resentful of Norman influence, the most powerful family in the kingdom was about to produce its most important son. Godwin's own position would not last forever, but before his death, it would pass to a young man quietly becoming, in these years, the most capable and most trusted noble in England, his son, Harold. By the early 1050s, the Godwin family's position in England had grown so dominant that it briefly provoked a direct confrontation with the king. In 1051, tensions between Edward and Godwin boiled over into open crisis, a dispute involving Norman favourites at court, a violent incident in the town of Dover, and Godwin's refusal to punish his own men for it. For a short time, the entire family was exiled, its lands and titles stripped away. It did not last. Within a year, Godwin and his sons returned with an armed following strong enough that Edward, unwilling to risk civil war, restored them to their former positions, a clear demonstration of where real power in England actually rested, not solely with the crowned king, but with a family wealthy and connected enough to force its way back from exile. Godwin himself died not long after this restoration, in 1053. His earldom of Wessex, the richest and most important in England, passed to his eldest surviving son, Harold. Harold Godwinson was, by this point, already an experienced and capable figure in his own right. He had shared in his family's exile and return, and had spent the years since establishing himself as a skilled military commander in his own theatre of operations, Wales. Through the 1050s and into the early 1060s, Harold led campaigns against the Welsh kingdoms on England's western border, culminating in a decisive 1063 campaign, fought jointly with his brother Tostig, that broke the power of the Welsh ruler Gruffydd ap Llywelyn and brought a rare period of stability to that frontier. These campaigns did more than secure a border. They gave Harold a reputation as a genuinely effective military leader, not merely a nobleman who had inherited his position, but a man who had proven he could command armies and win. By the time Harold reached his 40s, his position in England was extraordinary. As Earl of Wessex, he controlled more land and more revenue than any other noble in the kingdom, Edward included in some comparisons of personal wealth. He sat at the center of royal government, advising the king on matters of both domestic policy and foreign relations. Edward, for his part, seems to have come to rely on Harold heavily. Whatever tension had once existed between the crown and the Godwin family had, by the 1060s, given way to something closer to genuine partnership, at least in the practical business of governing the kingdom, day to day. Consider for a moment what life actually looked like for a man in Harold's position. An 11th century English earl of his rank did not live in a single fixed residence the way a modern person might imagine. Instead, he and his household moved regularly between estates scattered across his territories, consuming the produce of each manor in turn before moving on, a practical necessity in an age before efficient long-distance transport of food, and also a way of maintaining a visible presence across a wide territory. Travel was by horse on land and by ship along the coasts and rivers. A journey that might take a modern traveler an hour by car could occupy the better part of a day. An earl's household included not just family, but a retinue of armed retainers, servants, clergy, attached to his chapel, and officials responsible for managing his estates and collecting the dues owed him. Hospitality was a serious obligation. Feeding and housing this moving court, along with any guests or petitioners seeking the earl's judgment or favor, was a constant and considerable expense. This was the world Harold Godwinson inhabited by the mid-1060s. Wealthy beyond almost anyone else in England, militarily proven, politically central, and, though no one could have said it plainly at the time, positioned, more than any other single Englishman, to be considered for the throne whenever Edward's reign came to its end. It was around this time, in the early 1060s, that Harold made a journey across the Channel, one that would become, in the centuries since, among the most disputed and consequential episodes in the entire story of the Norman Conquest. Sometime around 1064, the exact year is not certain, Harold Godwinson crossed the English Channel and arrived, whether by intention or by accident, in the territory of Duke William of Normandy. Even the reason for the journey is disputed. Norman sources, writing after William had become king and with every reason to present the episode favorably to his own claim, say that Harold was sent by Edward specifically to confirm, on the king's behalf, that William would inherit the English throne. Other, later English traditions suggest a very different story, that Harold's voyage was accidental, the result of being blown off course or shipwrecked along the French coast on some unrelated errand, possibly an attempt to recover relatives held as political hostages in Normandy since his family's earlier exile. No reliable, contemporary English account of Harold's own reasons survives. What we have instead is largely the Norman version, and it should be read with that origin firmly in mind. What does seem clear is that Harold, whatever brought him to the continent, ended up at William's court, where the two men spent time together under circumstances that were, formally, those of honored guest and host. According to later Norman accounts, Harold even accompanied William on a military campaign into Brittany during this visit, fighting alongside Norman forces, a detail that, if accurate, suggests real time spent together, and that Harold was treated, at least outwardly, as an ally rather than a captive. It is the end of this visit that matters most to the story of 1066. According to Norman tradition, preserved most famously in the pictorial account, later embroidered into the Bayeux tapestry, alongside written Norman chronicles, Harold swore a solemn oath to William before departing, pledging to support William's claim to the English throne once Edward died. Some versions add dramatic detail that the oath was sworn over hidden holy relics, unknown to Harold at the time, making his later violation of it not merely a political betrayal, but something closer to a sin against sacred obligation. Here, a listener deserves honesty rather than a tidy story. We do not know, with anything approaching certainty, what Harold actually said or agreed to in Normandy. No contemporary English source describes an oath in these terms. The entire episode survives almost exclusively through Norman voices. Voices with an obvious and considerable interest in establishing that Harold had bound himself, freely and solemnly, to support William's succession, and had therefore broken a sacred vow when he later took the throne for himself. It is entirely possible that some kind of oath was sworn. Hostage-taking, alliance-swearing, and formal pledges of support were common features of 11th century diplomacy. And a guest in Harold's position, particularly if relatives of his were being held in Normandy at the time, may have had very little real freedom to refuse whatever was asked of him. It is equally possible that later Norman writers exaggerated or reshaped a more limited, more ambiguous exchange into the dramatic, binding oath their propaganda needed it to be. What can be said honestly is this: the oath, whatever its true content, became one of the central justifications William would use for his invasion of England 2 years later, and its exact nature will likely never be known with certainty. Harold returned to England sometime after this visit, resuming his position at the center of English government. Whatever had happened in Normandy did not, for the moment, change his standing. He continued to serve as Edward's most powerful and most trusted earl, continued to manage his vast estates across southern England, and remained, by any practical measure, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. But trouble was already gathering elsewhere, not from across the Channel this time, but from within Harold's own family, in the north of England, where his brother Tostig's rule as earl was about to collapse into open rebellion, while Harold's reputation in the south had grown steadily through military success and careful governance. His younger brother Tostig's position in the north was heading toward disaster. Tostig had been made Earl of Northumbria in 1055, taking control of a vast territory stretching across much of what is now northern England, a region with its own distinct traditions, its own sense of regional identity, and a long history of resisting rule, imposed from the south. Northumbria had never before been governed by a member of the Godwin family, and Tostig, arriving as something of an outsider, faced a genuinely difficult task in winning the loyalty of local nobles used to a different style of leadership. He did not manage this well. He is described, in the sources that survive, as ruling with a heavier hand than his predecessors, raising taxes that struck local landholders as excessive and dealing harshly, at times violently, with nobles he suspected of disloyalty. Whether this reputation is entirely fair is difficult to judge. Much of what we know about Tostig's rule comes from accounts written after his fall, when there was little incentive to present him sympathetically. What is not in dispute is the outcome. In the autumn of 1065, the nobility of Northumbria rose against him in open rebellion, seized the region's principal town, and declared they would no longer accept Tostig as their earl. This placed Harold in an extraordinarily difficult position. As the kingdom's leading noble and Edward's chief advisor, it fell to him to help resolve the crisis, and the rebels made clear they wanted a different earl entirely, not merely a chastened Tostig, restored to his old post. Harold traveled north to negotiate, and in the end, the decision that emerged favored the rebels over his own brother. Tostig was removed from his earldom, replaced by a new earl from an entirely different noble family. Humiliated and stripped of his position, he went into exile on the continent, taking his family with him. The rift this created between the two brothers would not heal. Tostig, in the months that followed, would come to see his own brother as having chosen political convenience over family loyalty, a grievance he carried into exile, and one that would, within a year, lead him to seek allies willing to help him reclaim what he had lost, whatever the cost to England itself. For Harold, the episode demonstrated the delicate balancing act required to hold together a kingdom built on regional loyalties as much as central authority. Northumbria's rebellion was not really about Tostig alone. It reflected a broader tension in how England was governed, between the crown's wish to place trusted men, often drawn from a small circle of powerful families, into positions of regional authority, and the expectation of local nobles that their region's affairs would be respected on its own terms. Harold's decision to side with the rebels, however painful within his own family, was in many ways the only choice that could hold the kingdom together in the short term. It came at a cost he could not yet fully see. With Tostig gone, and Northumbria's rebellion resolved, England seemed, for a brief moment, calm again. That calm did not last long. Within weeks, the king himself began to fail. Edward the Confessor had spent much of the final years of his reign on a single, deeply personal project: the construction of a new church at Westminster, just outside the walls of London, built in the newer Romanesque style he had known in Normandy, rather than the older architectural traditions of England. It was, by every account that survives, the great devotional work of his life, a building he intended as both a place of worship and, eventually, his own resting place. In the closing weeks of 1065, as Westminster Abbey neared completion, Edward's health began to decline sharply. Medicine in 11th century England, as across the rest of Europe, offered little real treatment for the kind of serious illness that seems to have taken hold of the king. Care in this era relied heavily on herbal remedies, prayer, and the presence of clergy, rather than anything resembling a clinical understanding of disease. Edward grew weaker through December, too unwell in the end to attend the consecration of his own great church, held on the 28th of December, 1065. He died just over a week later, on the 5th of January, 1066. What happened in the king's final hours has become one of the most consequential and disputed moments in English history. According to the account preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by Englishmen close to the events, though still composed with an obvious interest in supporting Harold's later claim to the throne, Edward, on his deathbed, commended the kingdom to Harold's protection, effectively naming him as his chosen successor. Other sources, largely of Norman origin and written later, either omit this deathbed designation entirely or reframe it as something less than a genuine grant of the crown, consistent with William's own claim that the throne had already been promised to him years before. This uncertainty deserves to be sat with, rather than resolved too quickly. 11th century English succession did not work by a simple, fixed rule of inheritance the way later medieval and early modern monarchies would come to operate. No strict principle guaranteed that a king's nearest blood relative, or any single named heir, would automatically succeed him. Instead, succession involved a combination of royal blood, the reigning king's wishes where they were known, and, critically, the formal approval of the Witan, the council of the kingdom's most powerful nobles and churchmen, who held real authority to select and confirm a new king from among the plausible candidates. Edward's own deathbed words, whatever they actually were, mattered a great deal to the story later told, but were not, on their own, sufficient to make anyone king. That decision still had to pass through the Witan. Edward the Confessor was buried in his new abbey at Westminster within days of his death, the very first king laid to rest there, beginning a tradition English and later British monarchs would continue for the better part of 1,000 years. He left behind no son, no clear and undisputed heir, and a kingdom now facing, openly and urgently, the question that had hovered unanswered through the whole of his 24-year reign: who would rule England next? The Witan did not take long to decide. The Witan met in the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, and its decision came remarkably fast. On the 6th of January, 1066, the very day of Edward's burial at Westminster, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. The speed of this decision has drawn attention from historians ever since. England in early 1066 faced real and immediate danger from more than one direction, and a vacant throne, even for a matter of weeks, risked inviting exactly the kind of foreign intervention a swift, decisive succession might prevent. Harold, whatever the strength or weakness of his formal blood claim, was the obvious practical choice. Already the kingdom's most experienced military commander, already deeply familiar with the machinery of royal government, and already, in effect, running much of the day-to-day business of the kingdom alongside Edward in his final years. Faced with the need to produce a king capable of defending England against threats already visible on the horizon, the Witan chose competence and readiness over a more distant, less proven claimant. It should be said plainly, Harold's own hereditary claim to the throne was, by the standards of royal bloodlines elsewhere in Europe, a weak one. He was not descended from the West Saxon royal line that had produced England's kings for generations. His authority rested instead on his family's wealth, his own proven ability, and now the Witten's formal approval, a form of legitimacy real and meaningful within English tradition, even if it looked different from the hereditary claims of a William or a Harald Hardrada. News of Harold's swift coronation crossed the Channel and reached two men with their own reasons to view it as an outrage. In Normandy, William received the news as confirmation of his worst suspicions, that Harold, whatever he had sworn during his visit years before, had chosen the crown for himself the moment the opportunity arose. From William's perspective, and from the perspective the Norman court would maintain and publicize in the months ahead, this was not merely a disappointment, but a betrayal, a broken oath, compounded by the seizing of a throne William believed had already been promised to him. Farther north, in Norway, an aging but still formidable king took note of events in England with interest of his own. Harald Hardrada had spent decades building a reputation as one of the most experienced and most feared warriors in Northern Europe, and he possessed, through a chain of earlier Scandinavian claims to the English throne stretching back to the Danish kings who had once ruled England directly, an argument of his own for why the crown might rightfully belong to him rather than to an English earl with no royal blood at all. Harold's coronation, in Hardrada's eyes, was simply one more obstacle standing between a Norwegian king and a throne he believed history had left open to him. Within England, meanwhile, Harold moved quickly to secure his new position. He traveled north to be formally recognized there, seeking the same acceptance from Northumbria that had so recently rejected his own brother. Almost immediately, he began preparing the kingdom's defenses, aware that his coronation had not settled the succession question so much as escalated it, turning a domestic dispute over the throne into something now threatening to draw in the two most formidable military powers in Northern Europe. England had a king. Whether England would be allowed to keep him was a question to be answered in the months ahead, not in the Witan's council chamber, but on the battlefield. William's response to Harold's coronation was neither immediate war nor quiet acceptance, but something more patient and calculated, a careful campaign to build both the material means and the moral justification for an invasion. The moral case came first, and it mattered enormously in the political world of 11th century Europe. William sought and received the support of the papacy for his planned expedition, support that, according to tradition, came with a consecrated papal banner sent to accompany the invasion fleet, a powerful symbol suggesting William's cause carried the Church's blessing. The exact diplomatic process behind this papal support is not fully documented, but its effect was significant, regardless of its precise mechanics. It allowed William to present his invasion to potential allies and to his own soldiers, not as naked conquest, but as a rightful and even sanctified expedition against a perjurer who had broken a sacred oath. With this moral groundwork in place, William turned to the far more difficult task of actually assembling an invasion force capable of crossing the Channel and defeating an English king with proven military experience of his own. This was, in the context of the period, an undertaking of enormous scale. William needed not only soldiers, but ships, hundreds of them, most built specifically for this campaign, requiring the felling and working of a staggering quantity of timber in a short span of months. Shipyards along the Norman coast would have hummed with activity through the spring and summer of 1066. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers constructing vessels capable of carrying not just men but horses, a critical element of Norman military tactics that required specially designed transport ships, since horses could not simply be loaded aboard an ordinary cargo vessel and expected to survive the crossing in fighting condition. Recruiting the army required William to look well beyond his own duchy. He drew fighting men not only from Normandy, but from Brittany, Flanders, and other parts of northern France, offering the promise of land and reward in a conquered England to nobles and knights willing to commit themselves and their followers to the campaign. This was, in effect, a coalition army, assembled through a combination of feudal obligation, personal loyalty to William, and the frank promise of profit. A promise that would, if the invasion succeeded, ultimately be paid for out of the confiscated estates of the English nobility itself. Feeding, housing, and paying an army and fleet of this size, for months before a single battle was fought, was a logistical challenge not to be underestimated. Grain, livestock, and other provisions had to be gathered and stored in quantities sufficient to sustain thousands of men and horses. Looking back from a distance of nearly 1,000 years, it is easy to focus only on the drama of the eventual battle and forget how much of William's achievement in 1066 lay simply in the unglamorous work of organization, in ensuring that when the moment finally came to sail, there would be enough ships, enough men, enough horses, and enough food to make the crossing worthwhile. Exact figures for the size of William's fleet and army are not known with any real precision. Later medieval and early modern writers offered numbers modern historians generally regard as exaggerated, and the true scale of the invasion force remains a matter of scholarly estimate rather than certain record. What is not in doubt is that by late summer of 1066, William had assembled, on the Norman coast, one of the largest and most ambitious cross-channel military expeditions ever attempted, and that it was, for reasons largely outside anyone's control, about to be delayed. Across the Channel, Harold watched and waited, preparing for an invasion that, for reasons of its own, refused for weeks to come. Of the three men whose competing claims would decide the fate of England in 1066, Harald Hardrada was, in one sense, the most experienced and formidable, and in another, the man with the thinnest genuine right to the throne he sought. By the time he set his sights on England, Hardrada was already in his early 50s, old by the standards of the period, for a king about to lead an invasion in person. He had not spent those decades quietly. As a young man, forced into exile after a failed rebellion in Norway, he traveled remarkably far from home, eventually serving for years in the Byzantine Empire's elite Varangian Guard, a unit made up largely of Scandinavian and later Rus warriors, who served as personal protectors and shock troops for the emperor in Constantinople. His time there took him on campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, and he returned to Scandinavia a wealthy man, having accumulated both a considerable fortune and a reputation as one of the most capable, battle-hardened commanders in Northern Europe. It was this reputation, as much as any single achievement, that earned him the name history remembers him by, Hardrada, meaning, roughly, hard ruler or ruthless. He used both wealth and reputation to reclaim a position in Scandinavian politics, eventually securing the throne of Norway itself. His claim to England rested on far more distant ground. Decades earlier, England had been ruled directly by Danish kings, part of a North Sea empire that briefly united England, Denmark, and Norway under a single crown. Hardrada's argument traced a line of succession back through this earlier Scandinavian rule, an argument with some basis in a prior agreement between Scandinavian rulers, but one that, by 1066, was genealogically distant and legally thin compared to the claims of either Harold or William. Put plainly, Hardrada's right to the English throne was the weakest of the three, resting less on inheritance than on the simple fact that he possessed the fleet, the army, and the reputation to make the attempt. What made his ambitions dangerous in 1066, rather than merely theoretical, was an alliance found close to home, with Tostig, Harold's exiled brother, still bitter over his removal from Northumbria and eager for any means of reversing it. Tostig had spent months since his exile, seeking allies willing to help him strike back at England, and in Hardrada he found a king with both the resources and the motive to act. For Hardrada, the alliance offered something beyond additional soldiers, a claim of local support, and a guide with real knowledge of the northern English coastline, its harbours, and the political fractures within Northumbria that might be exploited. By late summer of 1066, this alliance had produced a substantial invasion fleet, gathering along the Norwegian coast, a force built around the same essential elements as William's, though considerably smaller: longships, experienced warriors, and a commander whose decades of hard experience made him one of the most dangerous military leaders in Europe. That summer, England faced two separate and serious threats, gathering at once, one across the Channel to the south, and now, unexpectedly, another forming across the North Sea. Harold could not know as the weeks passed which threat would arrive first, or whether he would be forced to face them both together. Through the summer of 1066, Harold did what any capable commander in his position would do. He prepared for an invasion he knew was coming, without knowing exactly when or where it would land. His defense rested on two forces. The first was his fleet, stationed along the southern coast, to watch for any sign of William's ships crossing from Normandy. The second, and in many ways harder to manage, was the fyrd, the levy of free Englishmen called up for military service in times of danger. Consider what mobilizing the fyrd actually meant for the ordinary men who made it up. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and landholders of modest means, called away from their fields and workshops to serve for a defined period, typically bringing their own weapons and provisions, or receiving them through obligations owed by their local community. Keeping a force like this in the field for an extended stretch created real strain, and the strain grew worse as the summer wore on. Crops needed tending, harvests needed bringing in before autumn weather turned. Men who had left their land in early summer, expecting weeks of service, found themselves still waiting, still watching an empty horizon, as the growing season slipped away behind them. Harold managed this difficult balance for a remarkably long stretch of the summer, keeping both his southern fleet and a substantial portion of the fyrd assembled and ready. Through the months, an invasion seemed most likely. But by early September, the pressure had become impossible to sustain. The harvest could not wait any longer. Provisions for the assembled forces were running low, and many of the furred soldiers, their agreed period of service long since expired, needed to return home. Harold made the difficult, but arguably unavoidable decision to stand down much of his southern defense, releasing his fleet and dismissing a large portion of his army, trusting that if William had not come by now, an invasion in the near term had become less likely. The sailing season for a channel crossing was, after all, growing shorter as autumn approached. It was almost precisely at this moment, with Harold's southern defences reduced and his attention beginning to shift toward the ordinary business of governing a kingdom that had, for months, been braced for war. That news reached him of an invasion after all, not from Normandy, as everyone had expected, but from the north, where Harald Hardrada's fleet had appeared off the Yorkshire coast, with Tostig at his side. The long summer of waiting was over. What followed would require Harold to do something no 11th century commander could take for granted: move an army, at speed, across the length of his own kingdom, to meet a threat that had struck exactly where he was least prepared to meet it. In the early days of September 1066, Harald Hardrada's fleet came into view off the coast of Yorkshire, a substantial force of Norwegian ships, carrying Hardrada's own seasoned warriors, alongside Tostig and whatever followers he had gathered during his months of exile. They made their way up the Humber, and then the Ouse, penetrating deep into the heart of Northumbria, before making landfall and advancing on York, the region's principal town and the seat of the very earldom Tostig had lost the year before. York in the 11th century was among the largest and most important towns in England, a centre of trade with long-established Scandinavian roots of its own, going back to the days of Viking settlement generations earlier. Its walls, its markets, and its position on the river made it both a valuable prize and a natural point for the region's defenders to make a stand before the invaders could take it. That defence fell to the two earls now governing the north: Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar, Earl of Northumbria, the very man who had replaced Tostig after his removal the year before. Learning of the invasion, the two brothers gathered what forces they could and moved to meet Hardrada's army outside the walls of York, at a site remembered as Fulford, on the 20th of September. The battle that followed was a clear and costly defeat for the English defenders. The precise details of how the fighting unfolded are not well preserved. Troop numbers, formations, and the exact sequence of the engagement are largely lost to us, known only through brief and sometimes conflicting later accounts. What is clear is the outcome. Edwin and Morcar's forces were broken, suffering heavy losses, and the road to York lay open. Rather than storming the town by force, Hardrada and Tostig chose negotiation. York's leaders, facing a victorious army at their gates and no immediate prospect of relief, agreed to terms, a common and often pragmatic choice for a medieval town under this kind of pressure, since a negotiated surrender, however humiliating, typically spared a community the far worse fate of being taken by force. As part of the arrangement, hostages were to be exchanged, a customary way of guaranteeing both sides would honor whatever terms had been agreed. York, for the moment, belonged to the invaders. News of the disaster at Fulford and of York's fall travelled south to reach Harold as fast as a mounted messenger of the period could manage, likely within a matter of days, itself a considerable feat of endurance, along roads that were, by modern standards, rough and unpredictable. Harold, whose southern forces had only recently been stood down, now faced an urgent decision: gather what men he could, as quickly as possible, and march the length of England to confront an experienced and victorious enemy army in the north. He did not hesitate. What Harold accomplished in the days that followed is remembered, even among historians accustomed to skepticism about medieval troop movements, as a remarkable feat of logistics and endurance. In roughly 4 days, gathering additional forces as he went, Harold moved his army from the south of England to the outskirts of York, a distance that would represent a demanding journey even today, and one that, on foot and on horseback along 11th century roads, pushed both men and animals to their limits. Hardrada and Tostig, for their part, appear to have had no reason to expect Harold's arrival so soon. Their victory at Fulford was barely a week old, and the negotiated surrender of York had left them with little apparent cause for urgency. According to the sources that survive, part of their army had even been left somewhat lightly equipped, not anticipating that a fight might come again so quickly. They had made camp at Stamford Bridge, a crossing point a short distance from York, apparently arranging to receive the hostages promised as part of York's surrender. Instead, on the morning of the 25th of September, they found Harold's army approaching. What followed at Stamford Bridge was a hard-fought and ultimately decisive English victory. A famous tradition holds that a single Norwegian warrior held the crossing alone for a time, cutting down English soldiers attempting to force their way over the bridge, before finally being overcome. A vivid and memorable image, but one that belongs more to later legend than confirmed historical fact, however enduring and evocative the story has become. What can be said with more confidence is that the battle was long and costly, fought with the close, grinding intensity typical of infantry combat in this period, and that it ended in the near-total destruction of the Norwegian force. Both Harald Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the fighting. Hardrada's death brought an end to one of the most remarkable careers of any Scandinavian ruler of his generation, a man who had fought across half of Europe and the Near East, only to die on English soil, pursuing a throne with, in truth, only a distant claim upon it. Tostig's death closed a bitter final chapter to the rivalry with his brother, a rivalry that had begun in a political dispute over Northumbria and ended with Tostig leading a foreign army against his own homeland. Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge was, by any measure available to contemporaries, a triumph. He had marched the length of his kingdom in days, met and destroyed a formidable invasion force, led by one of Europe's most experienced commanders, and eliminated, in a single battle, both a rival claimant to his throne and the brother whose grievance had helped bring that claimant to English shores in the first place. He had little time to enjoy it. Even as Harold's exhausted army rested and tended its wounded in the north, word was already crossing England that a wind long awaited in Normandy had finally shifted, and that William's fleet, after weeks of frustrating delay, was at last putting to sea. For most of the late summer of 1066, William's invasion fleet had sat ready along the Norman coast, unable to sail. The reason given in the sources that survive is straightforward: unfavorable winds, holding the fleet in port through the very weeks when Harold's southern defenses were still assembled and waiting to meet exactly this kind of crossing. Whether the delay was purely a matter of weather, or whether William deliberately held back for reasons of his own, is a question historians continue to debate. The evidence does not allow it to be settled with certainty. What can be said is that the delay, whatever its true cause, worked enormously in William's favor in the end, since it meant his fleet did not attempt the crossing until after Harold had already been forced to stand down his southern forces and march north to meet Hardrada. When the wind finally turned, in the last days of September, William moved quickly. His fleet crossed the Channel and made landfall at Pevensey, on the Sussex coast, on the 28th of September, just 3 days after Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge, hundreds of miles to the north. The landing itself was, by surviving accounts, unopposed. No English army waited on the beach to contest it. Harold's forces were still occupied in Yorkshire, and whatever local defences existed along this stretch of coast were in no position to resist a force of William's size. William's men came ashore, unloaded their ships, and began establishing a secure base of operations. A task that included the construction of temporary fortifications, built quickly using earthwork and timber techniques the Normans had refined at home. From Pevensey, William soon moved his forces a short distance along the coast, to Hastings, a location offering a more defensible position and easier access to further supplies from Normandy across the Channel. The weeks that followed were not idle ones. William's army, now on hostile soil, needed to be fed, and this meant foraging across the surrounding Sussex countryside, a process that inevitably meant taking, sometimes forcibly, provisions from local farms and villages, whatever hardship this created for the people who lived there. This was standard practice for a medieval army operating away from its own supply lines, and it served a purpose beyond simple sustenance. A visible, active Norman presence in the region also functioned as provocation, a way of drawing Harold south to fight before he could gather additional forces or choose more favorable ground. News of William's landing reached Harold in the north within days, arriving while his army was still recovering from the exertions of Stamford Bridge. Harold now faced a decision that would define the rest of the conflict: rest his forces, gather reinforcements, and move south deliberately and in strength, or march immediately, trusting speed over preparation, the same approach that had served him so well against Hardrada only weeks before. Harold chose speed. Whatever judgment history has since passed on that choice, it would have seemed reasonable to a commander in his position. His rapid march north against Hardrada had succeeded brilliantly, catching an unprepared enemy and winning a decisive victory before they could properly organize a defense. Applying the same approach against William, moving quickly enough to strike before the Norman army could expand its foothold, gather strength from the surrounding countryside, or advance further inland on its own terms, had an obvious logic to it. There was also a more personal dimension. William's forces had been raiding and foraging across Sussex, his own home region by marriage and connection to the English throne he claimed. For a king who had just spent weeks defending the north, allowing the south to suffer similar treatment, while he waited and gathered strength may have felt, to Harold and to the nobles whose lands were affected, like an unacceptable failure of his basic duty as king. Whatever the reasoning, the practical cost was real. Harold's army, marching south, was drawn substantially from the same forces that had just fought at Stamford Bridge. Men who had covered enormous distances on foot in the preceding weeks, fought a hard battle, and now faced yet another long march south, with barely any chance to properly rest or recover. Along the way, Harold gathered what additional troops he could from the regions he passed through, but there was neither time nor opportunity to assemble anything close to the full strength England could, in principle, have mustered given more time. The core of his army at Hastings would be built around his housecarls, the small, highly trained, heavily armed professional soldiers who formed the backbone of any English royal or noble household, supplemented by furred forces gathered hastily from the nearest southern counties, rather than the full, broader levy a more patient approach might have allowed him to assemble. Whether a more deliberate approach would have produced a different outcome at Hastings is impossible to say with confidence from this distance. What can be said is that Harold arrived near William's position with an army that was, by almost any measure, less rested and potentially smaller than the force he might have fielded, given more time to prepare. A genuine strategic gamble, made by a king whose instincts, sharpened by a summer and autumn of nearly constant crisis, had so far served him remarkably well. By the 24th of September, Harold's forces had reached the area near Hastings, taking up a position on a ridge that offered a strong natural defensive line, high ground later remembered, in some traditions, as Senlac Hill. William, informed of Harold's approach, prepared to meet him. Two armies, each led by an experienced and battle-tested commander, each believing firmly in the rightness of its own cause, now stood within a day's march of one another. The waiting, on both sides, was nearly over. The ground on which the two armies would meet, on the morning of the 14th of October, 166, was not chosen by accident. Harold had positioned his forces along a ridge, the high ground later remembered as Senlac Hill, a position offering real tactical advantages to an army fighting primarily on foot. The slope in front of the English line meant any attacking force, infantry or cavalry, would have to fight its way uphill, tiring themselves against gravity before ever engaging English weapons. The flanks were protected by rougher, more broken terrain, limiting William's ability to simply go around the English line rather than through it. It was, in short, close to the best defensive ground available in the area, and Harold's choice of it reflected the same military competence he had already shown at Fulford's aftermath and at Stamford Bridge. The English army forming up along this ridge was built around a core of housecarls, professional, well-equipped warriors trained for this kind of fighting for years, armed with weapons including the long-handled Danish axe, capable in skilled hands of inflicting devastating damage, but requiring both strength and space to wield effectively. Around and behind this core stood the Fyrd, gathered hastily during Harold's march south, more variably equipped and less consistently trained, but still a substantial addition to the army's numbers. The English fought this battle almost entirely on foot, forming what is generally described as a shield wall, men standing close together, shields overlapping, presenting attackers with a dense, difficult-to-break line rather than a scattered or loosely organized force. Opposing them, William's army combined three distinct elements, in a way that was, for the period, relatively sophisticated. Archers formed the front line, meant to soften the English position before the main assault. Behind them came infantry, armed much as the English housecarls were, with swords, spears, and axes. And behind the infantry, forming William's most distinctive advantage, came mounted cavalry, armored horsemen, whose charges, while unable to simply ride through a well-formed shield wall, could be devastating against any part of the English line that broke or opened even briefly. Here, too, honesty about the limits of what we actually know matters. The exact size of either army at Hastings remains genuinely uncertain, Older popular histories have offered figures for both sides that modern historians treat with real skepticism, since medieval writers had every reason, whether to magnify a victory or excuse a defeat, to inflate or distort troop numbers, and no reliable contemporary source gives us anything approaching a trustworthy count. What can be said is that both armies were substantial by the standards of the period, and closely enough matched in overall strength that the outcome was genuinely uncertain to the men standing in the ranks that morning. Both commanders, by tradition, addressed their gathered forces before the fighting began, though the specific words attributed to either Harold or William in later accounts should be read as literary reconstruction rather than verified quotation. No reliable record preserves what either man actually said. What we can say with more confidence is the basic shape of the coming battle: an uphill assault by a combined force of archers, infantry, and cavalry against a static defensive line of shield-bearing infantry holding the high ground, each side committed, each side believing firmly that the day would end with their cause vindicated. As the morning mist cleared and the two armies came fully into view of one another across the sloping ground between them, the long chain of decisions, journeys, oaths and rebellions that had brought England to this point gave way, at last, to something simpler and far more immediate. Two armies, facing each other, waiting for the first order to advance. The battle began with William's archers advancing to loose volleys of arrows against the English line, an opening meant to weaken and disrupt the shield wall before the infantry and cavalry followed. Against a tightly packed, shield-bearing formation on higher ground, this initial assault achieved relatively limited results. The shield wall, by its nature, was built to absorb exactly this kind of attack, and little indicates the arrows alone did serious damage to Harold's line. What followed was a long, grinding sequence of Norman assaults against a defensive position that, for hours, simply refused to break. William's infantry advanced uphill into the English shields, engaging in the close, exhausting work of trying to force gaps in a wall of men who held every advantage of ground and formation. When infantry alone failed to achieve a breakthrough, William committed his cavalry, sending mounted charges up the slope against the English line, a tactic that, in most circumstances of this period, could use devastating effect against infantry, but which struggled against a shield wall that held its formation and refused to scatter under pressure. Horses, understandably, do not charge willingly into a solid, unbroken line of men and shields, and so long as the English held their ground, William's cavalry found itself unable to simply ride through the position by force. At some point during the long day of fighting came a moment that has become one of the most debated episodes in the entire battle. A portion of William's forces broke off their attack and began retreating down the slope, and a section of the English line, whether from overconfidence, a genuine belief the battle was turning in their favor, or simple confusion in the heat of fighting, broke ranks to pursue them. This pursuit proved costly. Once outside the protection of the shield wall and on the open, sloping ground below the ridge, the pursuing English soldiers became vulnerable to exactly the kind of cavalry attack the wall had, until that point, successfully prevented, and suffered heavy losses as a result. Whether this Norman retreat was a genuine rout, exploited once noticed, or a deliberate feigned withdrawal designed from the start to draw the English out of formation, remains a question historians debate without full resolution. Norman sources, understandably, tend to present it as a clever and intentional tactic, evidence of William's superior generalship. It is equally possible, and perhaps more likely, given the difficulty of coordinating such a maneuver reliably across an entire medieval battlefield, that what began as a genuine retreat was recognized and exploited only after the fact, rather than planned from the outset. What can be said with more confidence is that this pattern, Norman forces appearing to withdraw, portions of the English line breaking formation to pursue, and those pursuers then suffering disproportionately from cavalry attack in the open, seems to have repeated, in some form, more than once over the course of the battle, and each occurrence gradually thinned the ranks and weakened the cohesion of Harold's army. Through the middle hours of the day, despite these losses, the core of the English position held. Harold's housecarls, forming the heart of the shield wall around the king himself, continued resisting wave after wave of Norman assault, and for a long stretch of the afternoon, the battle remained a genuinely uncertain contest, rather than a foregone conclusion. This was not a battle decided quickly or easily by either side. It was, by the standards of medieval warfare, an unusually long and hard-fought engagement, stretching across most of a single day, itself a testament to how evenly matched and determined both forces were. Only as the afternoon wore on, as the cumulative effect of repeated cavalry attacks and the gradual thinning of the English ranks began to take its toll, did the balance of the battle start to shift decisively in William's favor. The English shield wall, worn down by hours of continuous fighting and steadily reduced through the costly pursuits earlier in the day, began to lose the cohesion that had made it so difficult to break in the battle's opening hours. Gaps that would have been quickly closed earlier in the day became harder to fill as casualties mounted and reserves dwindled. Throughout this long and difficult day, it was Harold's presence, and that of his household troops around him, that had held the English line together. What happened to the king himself in the battle's final stretch would become one of the most enduring and disputed questions in the entire history of the Norman Conquest, a question the story now turns to directly. As the afternoon light began to fade on the 14th of October, the English position, worn down by hours of continuous fighting, finally began to collapse. And somewhere in the final chaotic stage of the battle, Harold himself was killed. Exactly how he died is one of the genuine, unresolved mysteries of the entire conquest, and it deserves to be treated honestly rather than settled with false confidence. The image most people carry today, an arrow striking Harold in the eye, comes primarily from a particular reading of the Bayeux Tapestry, the great embroidered account of the conquest, commissioned within a few decades of the battle, likely under Norman patronage. The tapestry does show a figure near the words identifying Harold, clutching at an arrow near his face, in the final moments before the English line breaks entirely. But the tapestry's imagery at this point is damaged and has been subject to restoration over the centuries, and even in its clearest surviving form, it is difficult to establish with certainty which of two nearby figures represents Harold, or whether the arrow shown depicts his death at all, rather than an earlier moment in the fighting. Other sources offer different, and in some respects more troubling accounts. Certain written traditions, composed later and originating from Norman writers, describe Harold cut down by a group of William's own knights in the battle's final moments. A version of events that, if accurate, would suggest death by close combat, rather than a single arrow. These accounts, too, come from sources with their own interests and biases, writing well after the events they describe, and should not simply be accepted as more reliable than the tapestry merely because they take a different form. What can honestly be said is this: Harold died in the final stage of the battle, in circumstances violent and chaotic, and the precise manner of his death was not clearly or reliably recorded by anyone in a position to know for certain. The arrow in the eye tradition, whatever its origins, has become the story most remembered. But memory and certainty are not the same thing, and a documentary telling this honestly has to hold the two apart. With the king dead, the English line, already weakened by hours of fighting and the earlier losses from the pursuit episodes, finally gave way. What organized resistance remained collapsed into retreat, and as darkness settled over the battlefield, the long, close-fought contest that had lasted most of a single day came to its end. William's army held the field. Harold Godwinson, King of England for less than 10 months, was dead, along with a substantial portion of his household troops and much of the leadership that had, only weeks before, achieved a remarkable victory at Stamford Bridge. The scale of loss among the English nobility at Hastings is difficult to overstate. Beyond Harold himself, a significant portion of England's most experienced military leadership, drawn heavily from the housecarls who had formed the core of the shield wall, died in the battle's final hours. This was not simply the loss of a king. It represented, in a single afternoon, the loss of much of the leadership class capable of organizing any immediate, coordinated resistance to what would follow. William had won the battle. He had not yet won the kingdom. News of Harold's death and the collapse of the English army at Hastings spread quickly through the kingdom, and in London, the surviving members of England's political leadership faced an urgent question of their own: what to do now that the man they had crowned less than a year before was dead, and a foreign army stood victorious, barely 50 miles from the capital. For a brief period, there was an attempt to rally around an alternative candidate, Edgar the Atheling, a young man who, unlike Harold, actually carried genuine royal blood, a grandson of an earlier English king and a direct descendant of the old West Saxon royal line Harold himself had lacked. The Witan, or what remained of it in these chaotic weeks, along with the Earls Edwin and Morcar, themselves recently defeated at Fulford, but still figures of real regional authority, appear to have given at least initial support to Edgar's claim. But this effort never developed into anything resembling effective, organized resistance. Edgar was young and inexperienced, without a proven military record of his own, and the coalition supporting him lacked both the unity and the immediate military strength to seriously contest William's continued advance. Within weeks, this last attempt at an alternative English succession had effectively dissolved. William, meanwhile, did not march directly on London. Instead, he moved more methodically, advancing along a route through Kent and around the southern and western approaches to the capital, a strategy that combined continued displays of military force, including, at points, the burning of settlements that offered or seemed likely to offer resistance, with careful diplomacy aimed at persuading London's leadership that further resistance was futile. This combination of pressure and negotiation proved effective. By early December, London's remaining leaders, including Edgar the Atheling himself, came to William and formally submitted, offering him the throne that Harold's death and the collapse of organized resistance had, in practical terms, already made his. William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, the same church Edward the Confessor had completed only a year before his death, on Christmas Day, 1066. The coronation itself, according to the accounts that survive, was not the calm, celebratory ceremony one might imagine. Norman soldiers, stationed outside the abbey to guard against any final act of resistance, reportedly grew alarmed at the sound of the assembled crowd's acclamation during the ceremony, the traditional shout of approval expected at an English coronation, and, apparently mistaking the noise for the beginning of an uprising, set fire to nearby buildings. The result was a coronation, conducted amid genuine confusion and disorder outside the abbey walls, even as the formal ceremony inside proceeded to its conclusion. William, Duke of Normandy, now crowned William King of England. It was, in one sense, the end of the story that had begun with a childless king and an unresolved question of succession nearly a quarter-century before. Harold was dead. Hardrada was dead. Edgar's brief claim had collapsed without a fight. William, whose oath-based grievance had provided both the moral case and the occasion for invasion, now sat on the English throne he had spent the better part of a year preparing to claim. But a coronation, however grand, was not the same as genuine control over a kingdom the size and complexity of England. Beneath the surface of William's new crown lay a country that had not yet, in any real sense, accepted Norman rule, and the work of actually securing it, county by county, rebellion by rebellion, was only beginning. A crown, however formally won, did not translate automatically into control over a kingdom the size of England, and the years immediately following William's coronation made that gap painfully clear. Resistance to Norman rule did not end at Hastings. It surfaced, instead, unevenly and repeatedly across the following several years in different regions and for different local reasons, sometimes led by English nobles who had survived the battle and had no wish to accept a foreign king, sometimes arising from ordinary communities reacting to the immediate, concrete grievances of occupation, new lords demanding unfamiliar dues, garrisons stationed in towns that had never before had to house and feed foreign soldiers, familiar local authority steadily replaced by men who spoke a different language and answered to different loyalties. The west of England, the southwest, and above all the north, each saw periods of open rebellion in the years after 1066, and William, still consolidating a conquest that had won him a crown, but not yet a settled kingdom, met each with the same combination of speed and force that had served him at Hastings. It was in the north that this pattern reached its most severe and lasting form. Northumbria and the surrounding region rose in rebellion more than once in the years following the conquest, drawing at one point on support from Danish forces crossing the North Sea, hoping to exploit English resentment for their own ends. William's response, beginning in the winter of 1069 and continuing into 1070, has come to be remembered as the Harrying of the North, a deliberate campaign of devastation across a wide stretch of northern England, intended not merely to defeat the rebels in the field, but to destroy, comprehensively, the region's capacity to sustain any further resistance. Villages were burned. Livestock was slaughtered or seized. Stored grain and seed for the coming year's planting were destroyed. a decision whose consequences reached far beyond the immediate campaign, since a community stripped of its seed grain in winter faced not simply hardship, but genuine famine in the seasons that followed, with no ready means of recovery until crops could be re-established, often years later. Describing the human cost of the harrying without either minimizing it or slipping into a kind of dramatic language that turns real suffering into spectacle is not easy, and it should not be. What later chroniclers, writing years afterward, described was widespread starvation across large parts of the north, communities reduced to desperate circumstances, and, according to some of these later accounts, though precise figures cannot be verified, significant loss of life extending well beyond those killed in the fighting itself, among ordinary people who had taken no part in the rebellion but bore its consequences regardless. Modern historians treat the specific numbers offered by medieval chroniclers with appropriate caution, since exact demographic records simply do not survive from this period. What is not in serious doubt is that the harrying represented a level of deliberate destruction well beyond the ordinary practices of medieval warfare, and that its effects on the North's population and economy were severe and, in some areas, long-lasting. Alongside this military response to rebellion, William pursued a second, quieter, but ultimately more transformative strategy for securing his hold on England: the rapid construction of castles across the kingdom. These were not, in most cases, the grand stone fortresses later centuries would associate with the word castle. The earliest Norman castles in England were typically motte and bailey structures, an earthen mound, topped with a wooden tower, adjoining an enclosed courtyard protected by ditch and palisade, structures that could be razed relatively quickly using local labor and materials, yet still provided a defensible base from which a small Norman garrison could dominate the surrounding countryside. Over the years, following the conquest, these castles appeared in town after town across England, often built at real cost to the existing community. Houses cleared to make room for earthworks, local labor conscripted for the construction itself, and a permanent Norman garrison installed as a visible, daily reminder of who held ultimate authority over the region. For ordinary English families in these years, the conquest was experienced less as a single dramatic event and more as a slow, uneven accumulation of changes to the fabric of everyday life. A farmer who had held land under one arrangement for his entire life might find, within a few years of Hastings, that his lord had been replaced by a Norman baron he had never met, speaking a language he did not understand, expecting dues and services that might differ, sometimes significantly, from what had been customary before. A town that had governed its own affairs through familiar local officials might now find a Norman-appointed sheriff, backed by the garrison in the new castle overlooking the marketplace, taking a more direct and less familiar hand in local administration. None of this happened everywhere at once, or in precisely the same way. But across the years following 1066, region by region, English communities found themselves adjusting to a new layer of authority imposed from above, one showing little sign, in these early years, of being temporary. By the time William's reign reached its final years, the England he had conquered in 1066 had been reshaped in ways reaching far beyond who happened to sit on the throne. The most immediate and visible change was in who owned the land itself. In the years following the conquest, the great majority of England's Anglo-Saxon nobility, those who had not died at Hastings or in the subsequent years of rebellion, lost their estates, redistributed to William's Norman, Breton, and Flemish followers as reward for their part in the conquest. This was not a single, orderly transfer, but a gradual process, unfolding across roughly 2 decades, as rebellions were suppressed, as English landholders died or fled, and as William systematically replaced the old aristocracy with a new one, drawn almost entirely from those who had crossed the Channel with him. By the 1080s, only a tiny fraction of England's land is estimated to have remained in the hands of English lords who had held it before 1066, one of the most complete and rapid replacements of a ruling class in medieval European history. This transformation reached its most famous documentary expression in 1086, when William commissioned what has come to be known as the Domesday Survey, an extraordinarily ambitious effort to record, in detail, the landholdings, resources, and value of virtually every manor in England. Royal officials traveled the length and breadth of the kingdom, gathering information down to remarkably granular detail: who held each piece of land, how many plough teams and mills and fish ponds it contained, how many free men, villagers and enslaved laborers worked it, and what it had been worth both before the conquest and at the time of the survey itself. The scale and thoroughness of this undertaking had no real precedent elsewhere in contemporary Europe, and reflected, in its own quiet way, the same combination of ambition and careful organization that had characterized William's original invasion 2 decades before. For ordinary tenants and villagers across England, the arrival of the king's officials, asking detailed questions about their land, their livestock, and their obligations, was itself a vivid and often unsettling encounter with the reach of the new Norman government, a reminder that the Crown's interest in their daily lives extended down to the smallest and most local details of what they owned and owed. Alongside the redistribution of land, the English Church underwent its own substantial reorganization. Norman and other continental clergy were appointed to the great majority of England's bishoprics and major abbeys in the years following the conquest, gradually replacing an English ecclesiastical leadership that had, in some cases, held its positions for generations. New cathedrals and monastic buildings, constructed in the heavier, more massive Romanesque style favored on the continent, began rising across England in place of, or alongside, older, more modest Anglo-Saxon churches, a change in the physical landscape ordinary parishioners would have witnessed directly, as familiar wooden or smaller stone churches were rebuilt on a grander, unfamiliar scale. Language, too, changed, though more slowly and unevenly than the sweeping replacement of land ownership. French became the language of the royal court, of the new Norman aristocracy, and increasingly of formal legal and administrative business, while English remained the language spoken by the great majority of the population in their homes, fields, and local communities. This produced, over the following centuries, a long period during which England's ruling class and its common people operated, in a meaningful sense, in 2 different linguistic worlds, a divide that would only gradually narrow over generations, leaving behind, in the English language that eventually re-emerged as dominant even among the aristocracy, thousands of French-derived words that still mark the imprint of the conquest on everyday English speech centuries later. None of these changes arrived instantly or uniformly. For a farming family in a remote village, the practical experience of Norman rule might, in the early years, have amounted to little more than a change in who ultimately received the rents and dues owed on their land, the daily rhythm of ploughing, planting and harvest continuing much as it always had. For a townsperson living in the shadow of a newly built castle, or a monk watching his abbey's leadership replaced by unfamiliar continental clergy, the change was far more immediate and visible. The conquest, in other words, did not fall on England as a single uniform event, but as a long, uneven process of accumulating changes, some sweeping and rapid, others slow and generational, that together, over the decades following 1066, produced a kingdom recognizably different from the one Edward the Confessor had ruled, even as much of its older character, its landscape, and its people endured beneath the new arrangements imposed upon them. It has now been nearly 1,000 years since that October morning on the ridge above Hastings, and this is worth a quiet moment, at the end of the story, to consider not only what changed in England, but what endured. The conquest replaced a ruling class, redrew the ownership of the land, and reshaped the language of power and government. But beneath all of that upheaval, a great deal of England simply continued. The shires that had organized Anglo-Saxon government did not disappear with the Norman aristocracy that came to rule over them. Many of the same county boundaries, drawn centuries before Hastings, went on defining local administration for generations afterward, and echoes of them can still be traced in England's map today. The villages themselves, in most cases, were not swept away and rebuilt from nothing. Their fields, their boundaries, often even their names, carried forward largely unbroken. A Norman lord might now receive the rents once owed to an English earl, but the fields being ploughed and the families ploughing them were frequently the very same ones that had worked that land before 1066 ever arrived. Place names offer a particularly gentle kind of evidence for this continuity. Walk across England today and you will still find, scattered everywhere, village and town names rooted in Old English rather than Norman French, endings that once meant a settlement, a clearing, a farmstead, a river crossing, laid down by Anglo-Saxon and earlier communities long before William ever set foot on English soil. The Normans built castles, cathedrals, and new institutions, but they did not, on the whole, rename the land beneath them. The map of England today is, in this quiet way, still substantially the map of Anglo-Saxon England, however much lies buried beneath 1,000 years of change since. The parish church, too, tells a story of continuity as much as disruption. Many Anglo-Saxon churches were indeed rebuilt in the heavier Norman style in the decades after the conquest, and new cathedrals rose in places like Durham, Winchester, and Canterbury, on a scale England had not seen before. But the parish itself, the basic unit of local religious and community life, very often remained exactly where it had always been, serving the same community on the same patch of ground, sometimes incorporating older Anglo-Saxon stonework directly into the new Norman building, rather than discarding it entirely. Stand today in the older parts of many English parish churches, and you may be standing on foundations, or even beside surviving fragments of masonry that predate the conquest itself. Even the English language, pushed for generations to the margins of formal power, was never actually extinguished. French shaped it, enriched it, added a whole second vocabulary alongside its older Germanic roots, which is why English today so often carries two words for the same idea, one earthy and Anglo-Saxon, one more formal and French in origin. But English endured as the language of the fields, the markets, the homes, and the ordinary conversations of daily life, spoken continuously by the vast majority of the population throughout the entire period of Norman rule. It was English, in the end, that outlasted French as the dominant language of England, re-emerging over the following centuries, even among the descendants of the Norman aristocracy, who had once looked down on it. Institutions changed hands and changed form, but the underlying idea of a functioning, centrally organized kingdom, the shires, the courts, the machinery of royal administration Edward the Confessor and his predecessors had built and refined, did not vanish with the old dynasty. If anything, the Norman kings inherited and extended that machinery, using the same basic framework of English government their predecessors had left behind, adapting it rather than discarding it. It is tempting, looking back on 1066, to think of it purely as rupture, a single, dramatic year in which everything changed. And in many real ways it was. Harold's brief reign, the deaths of 2 kings and 1 earl within a matter of weeks, the redistribution of an entire kingdom's land into new hands. This was genuine, sweeping transformation, and nothing about this story should minimize that. But history rarely moves in such clean lines. Beneath the new castles and the new aristocracy, beneath the French spoken at court and the Romanesque stone rising over older foundations, an older England persisted, in its fields, its village names, its parish boundaries, its language, and in the quiet, ongoing rhythm of daily life that no conquest, however complete, could fully erase. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand 1066, not simply as an ending, and not simply as a beginning, but as one long, difficult transition within a story that had already been unfolding for centuries before, and that would go on unfolding, in its own slow way, for centuries after. Thank you for spending this time with the Sleepy Historian. If tonight's journey through 1066 kept you company as you drifted off, consider subscribing for more stories like it, whenever you're ready. For now, let the year 1066 fade quietly behind you, the armies long since gone home, the fields settled back into their old, familiar rhythm, and let yourself rest.